The message arrived on a Tuesday, in the gray hour before dawn over the Atlantic, and for a long time afterward the people who received it could not agree on what they had heard first, the words or the silence that came before them. It came on every channel at once, not a broadcast in the ordinary sense, but an intrusion, a hand reaching down through the layered defenses of human communication and simply setting itself upon every screen, every relay, every private receiver from the orbital shipyards at Ceres to the school terminals in coastal towns that had never in their history looked upward and expected anything but weather. The Ketzari Dominion did not ask permission to be heard. That was the point of the message. That was, in a sense, the whole of it. A figure filled the screens. Tall, robed in the gray and iron colors of the war apparatus that ruled the Dominion, its face a study in patient contempt. When it spoke, the words rendered themselves into 100 human languages at once, smooth and untroubled, the voice of a thing that has never once in its long life been made to wait. People of the small world, it said, you have been told that you are protected. You have been told that your ships matter, that your treaties bind us, that the distance between your sun and ours is a wall. You have been told a great many kindnesses by those who wished you to remain calm. We are not kind. We wish you to be afraid, because fear is the beginning of obedience, and obedience is the only future your kind has been offered. Attend, then. Here is a lesson. And then the figure stepped aside, and the screens showed a place, and in that place there was a child. Afterward, in the accounts and the inquiries and the long grieving that followed, no recording of what came next was ever played again. It was struck from every archive by unanimous decree, not because anyone feared it, but because to replay it would have been to do the Dominion's work for it a second time. What is known is this, and only this, that the child was human, that she was a girl not yet grown, that her name was Sepha-Ilan, and that she had been taken from the survey settlement at Halden's Reach 11 days before, along with her mother and 40 other colonists, when a Dominion patrol seized their unarmed vessel in space the Ketzari had begun, without warning or right, to call their own. What is known is that the Dominion chose her because she was small, and because she was human, and because they believed that the sight of a human child made an example would break something in the watching species that could not be repaired. They executed her to send a message. Let the record hold that sentence and no more of it. Let it hold the fact and refuse the spectacle, exactly as Earth in the end refused it. The Dominion had wanted the moment stretched, dwelt upon, replayed in the private nightmares of a billion souls until terror did its patient work. Earth would not give them that. What Earth gave them instead, in the fullness of time, was something the Dominion had not imagined possible, because it had never once believed that grief could be organized. The broadcast ended. The screens returned to weather, to market figures, to the ordinary business of an ordinary Tuesday, as if nothing had reached down and touched the world. And for perhaps 90 seconds in the gray hour before dawn, the human species did nothing at all. Then it began to weep. And then more slowly and far more quietly, it began to think. Commander Wren Costa was 27 years old, and she was in the observation ring of the destroyer Meridian when the message came, off shift and unable to sleep, watching the slow turn of Jupiter beneath her boots. She was young for her rank, young enough that older officers still occasionally addressed her as if she had wandered onto the bridge by mistake, and she had spent the better part of 3 years teaching herself to answer that assumption with silence rather than temper. She had a narrow, serious face, dark hair cut short for the helmet seals, and a way of going very still when something mattered, as though motion were a resource to be spent carefully. She went still now. She had known Sepha-Ilan not well. Once, 18 months before, on a diplomatic escort run out to the frontier settlements, the * Meridian had put in at Halden's Reach for 4 days, while the negotiators argued about water rights and mining claims, and all the small dignified things that free people argue about when they still believe the arguing will be allowed to continue. The colony children had been given a tour of the ship, because colony children always were, and Wren had drawn the duty of walking a cluster of them through the aft compartments, answering the questions children ask, which are better questions than adults think. One of them, a girl of perhaps 9 or 10 with a gap in her front teeth and a fierce, practical curiosity, had wanted to know how the engines knew where to push, not how they worked. How they knew asterisk. Wren had crouched down and tried to answer honestly, and the girl had listened with her whole body, the way only children and the very wise ever do, and at the end she had nodded as though a debt had been settled between them. Wren had not remembered her name until the broadcast gave it back. She did not weep. That would come later alone in the narrow bunk with the light off, and it would come hard. On the observation ring, watching Jupiter turn, she felt instead the strange cold clarity that some people mistake for calm, and that is actually its opposite. The mind stripping away everything that will not help, until only the essential remains. The Dominion had made a calculation. It had reasoned that the sight of a murdered child would frighten humanity into abandoning the frontier, into pulling back its colonies and its claims and its people, into becoming the small and biddable thing the Ketzari war apparatus needed it to be. It was, as calculations go, not unreasonable. It had worked before, on other species, in the long ledger of the Dominion's expansion. The galaxy was full of peoples who had learned to be small. The calculation was wrong, but it would take some time and a great deal of grief before the Dominion understood the precise shape of its error, and by then the understanding would not save them. Wren stood on the observation ring until the watch changed, and then she went to find her captain. The human response did not come the next day, nor the next week. This, more than anything, was what unsettled the Dominion's analysts in the seasons that followed, when they had leisure and cause to study what had been done to them. They had expected one of two things. They had expected panic, the frantic thrashing of a frightened animal, ships scattered and colonies abandoned, and the whole clumsy apparatus of a young civilization collapsing inward. Or they had expected rage, the hot and stupid rage of the wounded, a fleet flung across the border in fury to be broken against the fixed defenses of a Dominion that had been fighting wars since before humanity learned to smelt iron. They got neither. What they got was quiet. For 19 days after the broadcast, humanity did almost nothing that the Dominion could see. The colonies did not pull back, neither did they advance. The border patrols held their stations. The diplomatic channels went silent, but they did not close, and the closing of a channel is a thing an empire understands, while the mere going silent of one is not. Ships moved, but they moved the way ships always moved. Resupply and rotation and the endless housekeeping of a species spread thin across 100 worlds. Nothing gathered, nothing massed. There was no fleet upon the border, no defiant broadcast, no answering threat. The Dominion's War Council, the body it called the Iron Sept, met to consider this quiet and could not agree on what it meant. Some among them, the older and more careful, found it troubling in a way they could not articulate and said so, and were not thanked for it. Others, the confident and the ascendant, took the silence as proof of success. The humans had been shown a lesson and had learned it. They were afraid. They were doing the sums as frightened peoples do, and the sums were telling them what the sums always told the small. That resistance was arithmetic they could not afford. At the head of the Iron Sept sat the Archon Sevic V. Hal, and it was the Archon who had ordered the lesson, and the Archon who now declared the matter closed. He was old for a Ketzari, which is to say very old indeed, and he had spent the whole of his long life in the machinery of the Dominion's war, rising through it the way a blade rises through a body, and he had never in all that time encountered a problem that could not be solved by applied and demonstrated cruelty. Cruelty had made him. Cruelty had made the Sept, and the Sept had made the Dominion what it was. Not a nation, not a people, but an apparatus, a vast and patient engine for the conversion of other people's futures into the Dominion's power. The Ketzari themselves, the ordinary billions of them, farmers and clerks and shipwrights and grandmothers, had little say in any of it, and less love for it than the Sept liked to imagine. But the Sept ruled them, and ruled through them, and had ruled so long that most of the Dominion's subjects could no longer picture a sky the Sept did not own. The Archon Vihal considered the human silence and pronounced it fear, and turned the machinery of the Dominion to other matters. There were always other matters. There were always other small worlds. He had made, in his long career, a great many decisions, and nearly all of them had been correct in the narrow and terrible way that the decisions of tyrants are correct. This one was not, but he would not learn that it was not until the very end, and the learning would be the last thing he ever did. What humanity was actually doing in those 19 quiet days was arithmetic of its own. It is a strange fact about human beings, one that the Dominion's long study of 100 conquered species had not prepared it to understand, that they grieve most dangerously not when they are loud but when they go quiet. A screaming human is a human in the grip of a feeling, and feelings pass, and can be waited out. A silent human is a human who has finished feeling the first wave of the thing and has begun, underneath the silence, to organize. The species had done this before, in its own long and bloody internal history, on the scale of nations and the scale of the single grieving heart. It had learned, over 10,000 years of doing terrible things to itself and slowly, unevenly, learning not to, a truth that most of the galaxy's older powers had never had cause to discover, that the most dangerous response to atrocity is not fury. Fury burns out. The most dangerous response is resolve asterisk, cold and patient and exact, grief transmuted into purpose and held there, without heat, until the purpose is complete. The councils of Earth met, and they did not shout. The Sol Directorate, the loose and quarrelsome confederation of worlds and stations and interests that passed for humanity's central authority, was not a body given to unanimity. It argued about everything endlessly as a matter of temperament and of principle both. It did not argue about this. The delegates came into the chamber beneath the old dome at Geneva with the broadcast still behind their eyes, and they looked at one another, and the arguing simply did not begin. There was a question and only one, and it was not whether asterisk, it was asterisk how. Because here was the thing that the youngest voices in the chamber said aloud, and the oldest voices, to their lasting credit, listened to. It would be the easiest thing in the world and the most natural to answer the murder of a child with the murder of a people. The Dominion had shown humanity exactly how such things were done. It had handed over the template. The Ketzari homeworlds were known, their locations mapped, their populations counted. A species with humanity's ships and humanity's grief could, if it chose, reach across the dark and reduce the Dominion's cradle worlds to glass, and no one in the galaxy would have been surprised, and a great many watching peoples would even, in the privacy of their own long-suffering, have understood. That was the trap. That was the second half of the Dominion's message, the half that even the Archon had not consciously intended, the invitation to become what had wounded you. To answer the atrocity in kind was to prove the Dominion's oldest doctrine correct, the doctrine that underlay everything the Sept had ever done, which was simply that the universe belonged to whoever was willing to be the most terrible. To burn the Ketzari worlds would be to agree with the thing that had killed Sepha Ilan. It would be to say, yes, you were right, this is what power is, and now we are more powerful than you. Earth would not say that. The oldest voices in the chamber and the youngest agreed on it with a unanimity that felt, to those present, almost like a physical thing settling into the room. Whatever humanity did, it would not become the Dominion. It would not answer a murdered child with murdered children. The Ketzari billions, the farmers and clerks and grandmothers who had never voted for the Sept, because the Sept did not permit voting, who had never ordered a single atrocity because the Sept did not consult them, who were themselves in their own quiet way a conquered people beneath an apparatus they could not throw off, those billions were not the enemy. They never had been. The enemy was the apparatus itself. The Iron Sept, its fleets, its fortresses, its command, its archon, its whole vast machinery of impunity. That was the thing that had reached down and touched the world. That was the thing that would be answered. Not the species, the regime. Not extermination. Dismantlement. The distinction was fine, and it was total, and holding to it would prove to be the hardest thing Earth had ever attempted, harder by far than the burning would have been. It is easy to destroy. Any fool with enough energy can destroy. What Earth set out to do in those 19 quiet days was something the galaxy had never seen a wounded power attempt. To reach across the dark, and with surgical and overwhelming precision, cut a regime out of a civilization, the way a surgeon cuts a tumor out of a body it means to keep alive. To end the Sept and spare the Ketzari. To break the fleets and let the shipwrights live. To take the Archon and leave the grandmothers their sky. It would require a discipline that no rage could sustain, and so it would not be given to rage. It would be given, the Directorate decided, to grief that had gone cold and exact, and it would be carried at its sharpest point by the young. That was where Commander Wren Costa came in. She was summoned to Earth 11 days after the broadcast, pulled from the asterisk meridian with an abruptness that left her wondering, on the long shuttle down through the atmosphere, whether she had done something wrong. Officers of 27 were not, as a rule, summoned to Geneva. They were sent orders. They received the decisions of others and executed them and were grateful for the chance. Wren had learned to expect nothing else, and she sat in the shuttle with her hands folded and her spine straight, and her mind running through every mistake she might plausibly have made, which was a short list, because she did not make many. She was wrong about all of them. The room they brought her to was small, and there were only 4 people in it, and one of them was Admiral Idris Vane, whose name she knew the way every officer in the fleet knew it, the way one knows the name of a mountain. He was old, genuinely old, his face seamed, and his hands marked with the particular scars of a man who had come up through the engine decks in the years when the drives were less forgiving. He had commanded at the relief of Tethys and the long defense of the Karen line, and he had, it was said, refused promotion to the Directorate itself 3 times because he did not wish to stop going to space. He looked at Wren for a long moment when she entered, and she had the disconcerting sense of being read the way a man reads a chart. "Sit down, Commander," he said. "You knew the girl." It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. "For 4 days, sir, 18 months ago, she was one of the colony children we hosted at Halden's Reach." "You remember her?" "I do now, sir." Vane nodded slowly as if this too were data. "Everyone remembers her now," he said. "That's what they wanted. They wanted her to be a symbol. A warning." He leaned forward and something moved in the old face, something that Wren would spend a long time afterward trying to name and would eventually settle on as asterisk grief that had been kept a long time in a cold place. "We're going to let her be a symbol, but not their symbol, ours. Do you understand the difference?" "No, sir," Wren said, because it was true, and because she had learned early that Vane's reputation was built as much on his intolerance for confident ignorance as on anything he had done in the field. "Good," said the Admiral. "The ones who say they understand don't. Let me tell you what we're going to do, and then I'm going to tell you why it's going to be you who does the sharpest part of it, and you can decide whether you understand after that." And he told her. The plan had a name, and the name was not grand. Grand names were for the Dominion, for empires that needed to convince themselves of their own significance. The human operation was called, in the terse and deliberately unremarkable idiom of the fleet, Standing Order 17, and it would be remembered by that name long after the peoples who suffered under the Sept had found more fitting things to call it in their own tongues. What it was, beneath the flat designation, was the most ambitious act of precision warfare any human power had ever conceived. The total dismantlement of the Iron Sept as a functioning apparatus of rule, carried out across the whole span of the Dominion's territory, simultaneously, in a single coordinated stroke, with the explicit and absolute constraint that the Ketzari people and the Dominion's subject species were not to be harmed. It was, Vane admitted, very nearly impossible. That was rather the point. "Anyone can burn a world," he said, echoing without knowing it the words that had been spoken in the chamber at Geneva. "The Dominion can burn a world. They've burned dozens." Burning a world requires nothing but the willingness to do it, and the whole of the galaxy already knows we have the ships. What the galaxy does not know, and what the Sept has never once in its history had reason to fear, is whether anyone has the asterisk discipline to do the hard thing instead of the easy one. To go into their space, break their war machine down to the last fortress and the last flagship and the last member of their command, and walk out again with the civilian worlds untouched behind us. Nobody has ever done that to them. Nobody has ever tried. It's never been worth the cost, and it's never been possible to coordinate, and no one has ever wanted it badly enough to solve those problems. He paused. We want it that badly. And we've solved them. The solving had taken the whole of the 19 quiet days and the labor of 10,000 minds. Every asset humanity possessed had been turned to the single question of asterisk precision asterisk. Not how to hit the Dominion hard, which was easy, but how to hit only the Sept, which was not. The intelligence services had spent years mapping the Dominion's command structure without ever intending to use the map for this, and now the map became the weapon. The Sept ruled through a hierarchy that was, in the end, its great vulnerability. It was so contemptuous of its own subjects, so certain that only the Ketzari war caste mattered, that it had concentrated the whole of its real authority into a relatively small number of nodes. The fleets that enforced its will. The fortress stations that anchored its regions. The command citadels where its regional archons sat, and at the center of it all the anvil. The anvil was the seat of the Iron Sept, a fortress moon in orbit above the Dominion's cradle world, and it was from the anvil that the Archon Sevic Vihal ruled, and it was in the anvil that the whole of the Sept's high command was gathered, because the Sept trusted no one, least of all itself, and preferred to keep its powerful clothes where it could watch them. This was, again, the arrogance of a thing that has never been made to fear. The Sept had concentrated its command into a single fortress, because it could not imagine any force reaching that fortress. In doing so, it had made itself into exactly the kind of target that human precision was built to take. "We hit them everywhere at once," Vane said, and moved his scarred hand across the display that had risen between them, the whole Dominion laid out in light. Every fleet node, every fortress, every regional citadel, simultaneously, so that no part of the Sept can reinforce another, so that the whole apparatus comes apart in the same hour before it understands what's happening to it. That's the shape of it. That's the body of the work, and it will be done by the fleet, by thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of hands, and most of them will never know they were part of anything but their own small piece of it. He stopped. The old eyes came up and settled on Wren. But the head of it, the anvil, the archon, the high command that has to be taken by hand. Not burned, taken. Because if we simply destroy the anvil from a distance, then the Sept becomes a story the Dominion tells itself. Martyrs. A wound to be avenged. But if we walk into the heart of their fortress and take the archon alive asterisk and put him and his Sept before a lawful reckoning where the whole galaxy can see it, then the Sept becomes what it actually is. Not a fallen glory. A crime tried and answered. That's the difference between vengeance and justice, Commander. Vengeance leaves a grave for the enemy to weep at. Justice leaves a verdict. He let the words sit. The boarding of the anvil is the sharpest point of the whole operation. It is the part most likely to fail and the part that matters most, and I have spent 19 days choosing who will carry it. I want it carried by someone young. Wren said nothing. Her heart had begun, against her will, to beat very hard. "You want to ask me why?" said Vane. "Ask." "Why, sir?" Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later, that it had been steady. "Because the Sept is old," the Admiral said. "Because everything about it is old, old cruelty, old certainty, old contempt, an apparatus that has been doing the same terrible thing for so long that it cannot conceive of the terrible thing ending. When they picture the enemy that might come for them, if they picture one at all, they picture something like themselves. Old, hard, made of the same stuff they're made of. They will not understand until it is standing in front of them that the thing which came across the dark to end them was young, that it had barely begun, that the future they thought they were frightening into obedience simply refused. There is a message in that, Commander, sharper than any we could broadcast. They killed a human child to tell us we had no future. I am going to send them their answer in the shape of one. Not a child, but young. Someone whose whole life is still ahead of her, standing in the ruin of everything they built, telling them it's over." He sat back. "I read your file. I read the account of Halden's Reach. I read what the children wrote about the officer who answered their questions like the questions mattered. I have been looking these 19 days for the right hand to carry the sharpest point of this. I believe it is yours, but I will not order it. This is not a thing that can be ordered. Do you understand asterisk now?" And Wren found, to her own surprise, that she did. "Yes, sir," she said, "I'll carry it." They gave her a ship and a company, and 4 weeks to make them into a single instrument, which was not enough time and was all the time there was. The ship was the assault carrier asterisk Cepha's answer, renamed, in the days before Wren took command, from something forgettable, and the renaming was not sentiment but doctrine. Every soul aboard would know, every hour of every watch, exactly what they were and were not there to do. The name was a discipline. It said, "Remember the child, and remember what you are not permitted to become in her name." Wren understood this the moment she read the new designation on the hull, and she understood too that the Admiral had chosen it, and she understood that it was, among other things, a test of whether she could carry a symbol without being crushed by it. The company was drawn from the boarding services, the specialists who fought in the cramped and lethal geometry of ship-to-ship and fortress assault, and they were, to a soul, better at their work than Wren was at hers. This was as it should be. Her work was not to be the best fighter in the company. Her work was to hold the whole of it to the single hardest thing, in the moment when it would be easiest to let go of it. She spent the 4 weeks learning them, one by one, because Vane had taught her long ago, in the offhand way that the best teaching happens, that you cannot ask people to do the impossible unless you have first taken the trouble to know exactly who they are. There was Sergeant Okonkwo, who had lost a brother to Dominion raid a decade before, and who came to Wren in the 2nd week and asked, plainly, whether he should step down, because he did not trust what he might do if the Archon were within reach of his hands. Wren did not tell him it would be fine. She told him the truth, which was that she needed men who were afraid of their own rage more than she needed men who felt none, because the first kind could be trusted to watch themselves. He stayed. There was Corporal Aline Devar, 19 years old and the youngest of them, who had been a colony child herself once, on a world the Dominion had taken years before, and who understood in her bones the thing that Wren was only beginning to understand with her mind, that the Ketzari children on the cradle world were exactly as innocent as Cepha Ilan had been, and that anyone who forgot that even for a moment had already lost the war that mattered. There was the medic, Bel Anya, who insisted, over the objections of the tactical planners, and with Wren's full backing, that the boarding force carry twice the standard load of medical supplies because, if we take that fortress and there are wounded in it who aren't Sept, and we don't have the means to help them, then we're not who we say we are. The extra mass cost them speed. Wren approved it anyway. It was, she would later think, the most important tactical decision she made in the whole of the operation, though it saved not a single second and won not a single fight, because it was the decision that told the whole company, without a word, what kind of thing they were. And there were 200 others, and Wren learned them all, and in the learning she stopped being the young officer who had wandered onto the bridge by mistake, and became something the fleet did not yet have a word for, the sharp point of a grieving world's resolve. The Dominion in those 4 weeks saw nothing. This was the strangest and most disciplined part of the whole endeavor, and the part that the Sept's analysts would study longest afterward, with the baffled attention of a creature examining the trap that has already closed on it. Humanity assembled the largest coordinated fleet action in its history. Thousands of vessels, drawn from every station and yard and reserve, threaded across the vast dark toward 100 separate points in Dominion space. And the Dominion did not see it coming, because humanity had spent those 19 quiet days learning precisely what the Dominion could and could not see. The Sept's certainty was its blindness. It watched the border because the border was where it expected an enemy to mass, and it watched for a fleet because a fleet was what its own doctrine told it to fear. It did not watch the long dark spaces between the stars, the empty and unregarded routes that no sane fleet would use because they were slow and cold and offered no support. Humanity used them all. It sent its ships out in ones and twos and small quiet groups, along 100 different paths, timed with an exactness that had cost the labor of those 10,000 minds, so that they would converge on their 100 targets not gradually, not detectably, but all at once in the same hour, out of the empty dark the Sept had never thought to guard. And at the center of that convergence, threading the longest and coldest and loneliest route of all, ran the Cepha's answer asterisk, bound for the anvil, carrying a young commander and 200 souls, and a discipline that no rage could have sustained, toward the fortress at the heart of an empire that did not yet know it had already lost. The voyage to the anvil was the longest and coldest of the 100 paths humanity threaded through the dark that season, and it gave Wren Costa a great deal of time to think, which was both the gift and the burden of it. She had asked before they left to read the settlement records from Halden's Reach, not the intelligence files which she had been given without asking, but the ordinary records, the manifest of the seized survey vessel, the colony roster, the small dull documents of a small living place. She wanted to know who the 40 other captives were, the ones taken alongside Sepha Ilan and her mother, the ones the Dominion had not chosen to make an example of, and had therefore simply kept, somewhere, in the dark holds of the war apparatus. Because the operation had a constraint that Wren had insisted on adding to it, and that Admiral Vane had approved without hesitation, and that had cost the planners a difficult week of work. Wherever the reckoning found human captives, or captives of any people, it would free them, not as an afterthought, as a priority equal to the taking of any fortress. The records told her that the survey settlement had held 211 souls, that it had been founded 9 years before by families who wanted, in the plain language of the founding charter, room and quiet, and the chance to raise children under an open sky, that it had grown a school and a clinic, and an argument about water rights that had never been resolved because the resolving had been interrupted by a Dominion patrol that decided the settlement's sky was not, after all, to be open. The records held the names of the taken. Wren read every one of them. She made herself do it in the cold of the long voyage, the way she made herself watch the cost of everything, not because it helped the operation, but because she had decided that a person who spent lives and dealt Oblivion had a duty to know, precisely and by name, on whose behalf she did it. The girl was one name among 211. The whole point of the thing was that she was not more valuable than the others and not less. The Dominion had chosen her because she was small and human and would make a vivid warning. Earth would answer for all of them and would say, in the shape of the answer, that no one of them had been an acceptable price for anyone's obedience. She thought, too, about the Archon, though she did not yet know his name would be given to her to take. She thought about the kind of mind that could look at a child and see an instrument. She had grown up, like most humans of her generation, on the far side of her own species' long and terrible education, in a world that had spent 10,000 years doing unspeakable things to itself and slowly, unevenly, at enormous cost, learning not to. She knew that the capacity to see a child as an instrument was not alien to humanity. It was, in fact, humanity's oldest sin, the one the species had spent the whole of its bloody history learning to recognize and refuse. That was the thing the Dominion did not understand, and could not have understood, because it had never done the learning. It thought cruelty was strength because it had never been forced to discover, the hard way, over and over, in the ruin of its own worst impulses, that cruelty is only ever the failure to have grown up. Humanity had been the Sept once, in 100 small and local forms. It had burned its own villages to send messages. It knew exactly what the Sept was, because it had been that thing and had crawled, bleeding, out of it, and the crawling had left it with a knowledge the Dominion lacked, that the wound does not have to be passed along, that the chain can be broken, that a grieving people can choose at cost to be the place where the cruelty stops. That was the whole of the doctrine, in the end, beneath all the tactics and the precision and the cold arithmetic of the withheld blow. Standing Order 17 was, when you stripped it to the bone, a single sentence that Wren carried with her down the long, cold path to the anvil and that she would carry for the rest of her life. The cruelty stops here. Not, we will out-cruel them. Not, we will teach them terror. Only, it stops, with us. Now, whatever it costs. You've gone still again, said Belle Anya, finding her in the observation blister in the middle of a sleep cycle neither of them was keeping. The medic had a way of appearing when Wren was thinking too hard, which Wren suspected was not an accident. That's the third watch running. The company's starting to talk. Let them talk, Wren said, but she said it gently. They're not worried about you, Anya said. They're worried for *you. There's a difference and they know it, which is more than most companies would. They know what you're carrying. She settled against the frame of the blister, looking out at the cold, streaming dark. Can I say a thing, Commander, that you won't like? You will anyway. You can't hold all of it, the whole cost. Every name, every face, every one of ours who's going to die taking that fortress by hand instead of from orbit. You've decided you have to look at all of it, and I understand why, and it's the right instinct, and it's going to break you if you don't let some of us carry a piece. Anya's voice was steady and kind. That's what a company is for. You don't have to be the only one who refuses to look away. Let us look with you. 200 people looking at the cost together can hold what one commander looking alone cannot. Wren was quiet for a long moment. Below them, or above them, or in whatever direction the fiction of down had chosen for the watch, the cold dark streamed past, and somewhere ahead in it the anvil hung waiting, and behind them a grieving world held its breath. How's the extra medical mass stowing? She asked at last, which was not a change of subject, and the medic knew it was not. Secured and doubled, Anya said, ready to save the children of the people who killed her. Good, said Wren Costa. Then we're who we say we are, keep it that way. That's an order I'm giving the whole company, and I'll give it again before we go in, and I'll give it every watch until it's over. Whatever we find in that fortress, whoever we find in it, the cruelty stops with us. She turned from the dark at last and looked at the medic, and something in the young, serious face had settled into a thing that would not be moved. That's the message we're carrying. Not fear, not vengeance, just that. It stops here. And the Sepha's answer ran on through the cold, carrying its 200 souls and its doubled medical stores and its single unbending sentence, toward the fortress at the heart of an empire that had never in its long life imagined that the thing coming to end it would arrive carrying mercy as a weapon. The reckoning began in silence, as everything else in that grief had begun, and the first the Dominion knew of it was the sky going wrong all at once, in 100 places in the same hour. It is worth understanding what the Iron Sept had built, in order to understand what it meant that the building came apart so quickly. The Dominion was not a small thing. It spanned dozens of star systems, held hundreds of worlds, commanded fleets whose oldest hulls had been ancient when humanity was still arguing about the shape of the earth. Its power was real, and its cruelty was efficient, and the peoples it ruled had spent generations learning that there was no wall high enough and no distance great enough to keep the Sept from reaching them. The Sept had made itself the fixed and permanent fact of that whole region of the galaxy, the immovable center around which a dozen conquered civilizations were made to turn. Empires do not last so long by being fragile. Whatever else the Iron Sept was, it was not fragile. And it came apart in a single hour, because humanity had understood something about it that it had never understood about itself, that its strength and its structure were the same thing, and that the thing which made it strong was exactly the thing that would let it be taken apart cleanly. The Sept had concentrated its power. That was its nature, to trust no one, to hold authority close, to gather its fleets at its fortresses and its commanders at its citadels, and its whole real weight into a small number of hard, bright points. A more diffuse empire, a messier one, a thing with its power spread thin and tangled through the lives of its ordinary people, could not have been dismantled without dismantling the people too. The Sept had done humanity the great and unintended favor of separating itself from its own subjects. It had drawn a clean line, over centuries, between the apparatus that ruled and the billions who were ruled, because it despised those billions and wished never to be mistaken for them. Humanity cut along that line. At Veth Karen, the fortress that anchored the Dominion's coreward frontier, the Sept's regional fleet lay at anchor in the long orbits, 90 warships and their tenders arranged in the confident, unhurried disposition of a force that had not been made to fight in living memory. They were not at their stations. They had no reason to be. The human ships came out of the cold dark between the stars, out of the empty routes the Sept had never watched, and they did not announce themselves and they did not demand surrender, because a demand would have given the fortress a chance to signal, and the signal was the one thing the whole operation was built to prevent. They came in with their weapons already speaking, and they spoke to the warships and the fortress guns and the command spires, and they did not speak to anything else. The shipyards at Veth Karen, where 40,000 Ketzari laborers worked the great slips, were not touched. The orbital habitats where the families of those laborers lived were not touched. The human gunners had spent 4 weeks learning the difference between a warship and a habitat at every range and every angle, drilled on it until the distinction lived in their hands below the level of thought. And when the hour came, they made the distinction under fire, in the chaos of a battle, without a single lapse that anyone ever found. The Sept's regional fleet at Veth Karen ceased to exist as a fighting force in 19 minutes. The 40,000 laborers watched it happen from the slips, and afterward, when they understood what had been spared and what had not, a great many of them wept, and not for the fleet. At the Duvik Citadel, where a regional archon ruled a subject species that the Sept had held in bondage for 200 years, the human boarding force came through the command levels like a cold wind and took the archon and its guard and left the Duvik administrators. The conquered, the collaborators, the ones who had done the Sept's paperwork because the alternative was death, untouched, and for the first time in 2 centuries, unwatched. Some of those administrators in the hours that followed did not know what to do with themselves, having never in their lives made a decision that the Sept had not first permitted. The human commander who took the citadel, a major named Reyes, gave them no orders. "It's not ours to run," she told them when they came to her looking for the new master they assumed had arrived. "It never was. It's yours. It always was. We're only here to take the ones who told you otherwise." And she took them and left, and behind her a subject people stood blinking in a freedom so sudden and so total that many of them, for a time, could not tell it from abandonment. This was the pattern, repeated across the whole span of the Dominion in the same terrible hour. The fleets broke, the fortresses fell. The regional archons were taken, one after another, by boarding forces that had been drilled past exhaustion in the single hardest discipline of all. The discipline of the withheld blow, the shot not taken, the door not breached, the rage not indulged. Everywhere the Sept was, humanity was, and everywhere the sept was ended precisely, and everywhere the sept was not, the habitats, the farms, the shipyards, the schools, the vast ordinary life of the Dominion's billions. Humanity passed through like weather and left it standing. The galaxy watched, because the galaxy could not look away. The other powers, the old civilizations that had long ago made their private peace with the sept's existence, because the alternative seemed to be endless war, watched the reckoning unfold and understood slowly that they were seeing something without precedent. They had expected, those who had expected anything, a war of extermination, the wounded young species proving at last that it was as terrible as everyone had suspected. What they saw instead was a thing they had no framework for, overwhelming force wielded with total restraint, a power that could have burned the Dominion to its foundations and chose, at enormous cost to itself, to burn only the part that had earned it. It was slower than burning. It was more dangerous than burning. It cost human lives that a bombardment would have saved, because precision means going close, and going close means being reached. Humanity paid that cost. It paid it in the same cold, exact, grieving currency it had brought to the whole endeavor, and the galaxy watched it pay, and something in the long settled order of that region of space began, quietly, to change. Because here was the thing the watching powers understood, the thing that mattered more in the long run than any fleet. A species had just demonstrated that it was strong enough to be terrible and had chosen, deliberately, publicly, at a price, not to be. That is a rarer and more frightening kind of strength than cruelty, and every old power watching knew it, and none of them ever forgot it. Aboard the Cepha's answer asterisk, threading the last cold miles toward the anvil, Wren Costa watched the reports come in on the tactical display, and felt each one land somewhere below her sternum, a slow accumulating weight of things going right that felt nothing at all like triumph. Vethkaren secured, the Duvik Citadel taken, the Coreward fleets broken, the regional command falling, node by node, exactly as the plan had drawn it, and the plan had drawn it well, and the drawing was being paid for in the only currency that mattered. Because the reports also carried the other numbers, the ones the planners had spoken of in flat voices, and the ones that were not flat at all when they arrived attached to names. The boarding force at Vethkaren had lost 31 souls taking the command spire by hand rather than reducing it from range. The Duvik Citadel had cost 11. Precision had a price, and the price was human lives spent to spare Ketzari ones, and Wren watched that price being paid across the whole Dominion and understood, with a clarity that would never entirely leave her afterward, exactly what her species had chosen to be. "They could have burned all of it," said Bel-Anya quietly beside her, watching the same display. The medic's hands were still. 1 order, 1 hour. None of ours would have died at all. "Yes," Wren said. "I keep waiting to be sure it was the right choice, that it was worth them." Anya's voice did not break, but it went very careful. "Okonkwo's cousin was on the Vethkaren assault. He's not on the list of who walked out." Wren was quiet for a moment. The anvil hung ahead of them in the display, still hours distant, a hard, bright point above a blue-green world where a billion Ketzari were going about the ordinary business of an ordinary day, most of them not yet knowing that the sky above them had changed forever. "When we walk into that fortress," she said at last, "there are going to be Ketzari in it who aren't Sept cooks, clerks, medics, children of the officers maybe, people who were born inside the machine and never had a choice about it. And every one of ours who died today, Okonkwo's cousin, all of them, they died so that we could still be the kind of people who spare those Ketzari when we get there. That's what they bought, not a fortress, not a victory. They bought us the right asterisk to walk into the heart of the thing that killed Sepha Ilan and not become it." She turned from the display and looked at the medic. "If we get in there and we cut down some frightened Ketzari cook because it was faster, or because we were angry, or because he was in the way, then Okonkwo's cousin died for nothing. Then it was just another burning done slowly. The whole point is the mercy. The mercy is the entire point. The rest is just the cost of being able to afford it. Anya looked at her for a long moment. "You're 27, she said, not unkindly. "I am," Wren said. "The Admiral chose well." "The Admiral," Wren said, "chose someone young enough that they still believe the hard thing is possible. That's all it is. Older officers know too much about how these things usually go." She turned back to the display, to the bright hard point of the anvil hanging above its unsuspecting world. "We're not going to let this one go the way these things usually go." On the anvil, the Archon Sept Vihal learned that his empire was ending in fragments, and could not, at first, make the fragments cohere into a shape. The reports came to him wrong. That was his first understanding of the scale of it, not the losses themselves, which were catastrophic, but the asterisk manner of the losses, which made no sense to a mind that had spent its whole long life inside the Sept's assumptions about the universe. Fleets did not simply vanish in 19 minutes. Fortresses did not fall without a siege. Regional archons were not taken, they died gloriously, or they held out, or they surrendered on terms, but they were not lifted out of their command chairs by boarding parties and carried off like contraband. And nowhere in any of the reports was the one thing the Archon's every instinct told him to expect: the burning, the reprisal, the enemy proving itself. The habitats were intact, the shipyards were intact, the subject worlds were intact, their populations untouched, their ordinary billions still breathing. The humans had come into Dominion space with a force that could clearly have reduced the whole of it to ash, and they had the Archon turn the fact over and over and could not make it lie flat. They had spared it. They had spared everything except the Sept, as if the billions of Ketzari, the subjects, the whole vast body of the Dominion, were of no interest to them at all. As if the only thing they had crossed the dark to end was the apparatus itself, and the Archon at the center of it, and nothing else in all the Empire was worth their notice or their wrath. He did not, even then, understand it as mercy. His mind had no room for the concept. It had been trained out of him across a lifetime, the way certain muscles atrophy from disuse until the body forgets they were ever there. He understood it, instead, as a message aimed with terrible precision at him. The humans were not punishing the Dominion. They were punishing the Sept. They were telling him, in the only language he had ever respected, which was the language of demonstrated power, that they saw exactly what he was and exactly what he was not, that they distinguished the tyrant from the tyranny's victims with a clarity his own regime had never once managed, and that they had come across the dark not to conquer his empire, but to remove him from it, the way one removes a rot and leave the rest to heal. And for the first time in his very long life, the Archon Sept Vihal was afraid. Not of death. He had made his peace with death long ago, in the abstract, confident way of a man who has spent decades inflicting it. He was afraid of something for which he had no name, because he had never in his life had cause to feel it. The fear of a creature who has just realized, all at once and far too late, that the moral universe it dismissed as a fiction was real the whole time, and that it is standing in judgment, and that the judgment is coming up the corridor. He gave the order to defend the anvil. The order was obeyed. The Sept's finest, the household troops of the war apparatus itself, took their positions in the fortress moon's endless armored corridors, and they were very good, and there were a great many of them, and the anvil had never in its history been breached. Far out in the cold dark, the Sepht's answer came on and did not slow. The Sepht's answer came in against the anvil's defenses in the last hour of the reckoning, and the taking of the fortress moon was, by every measure the fleet used, the hardest single action of the whole operation, and Wren Costa led it from the second wave, which was where a commander led such things from if the commander understood anything at all. The approach cost them. The anvil's outer batteries were not the neglected guns of a fortress at peace. The Sept had kept its own citadel sharp even as it let its distant frontiers grow complacent, and the fire that met the assault carrier was accurate and heavy and unafraid. The Sepha's answer took it and closed anyway, its escorts dying around it to open a lane, and Wren stood in the assault bay with 200 souls in hard armor and watched, on the repeaters, the ships that were spending themselves to put her force against the hull. She did not look away from it. She had decided, weeks before, that she would not permit herself to look away from any part of the cost, and she held to that now, watching the escorts burn, until the carrier struck the anvil's flank and the boarding tubes drove home, and there was no more time for watching anything. Then the doors opened, and the fortress was in front of them, and the discipline began. The Sept's household troops fought the way troops fight who have never lost and cannot imagine losing, which is to say with great skill and no imagination, and the human boarding force went into them with the opposite qualities and found them, at first, an even match. The corridors of the anvil were built for exactly this, a lethal geometry of armored angles and killing lengths, and the household troops knew every meter of it and the humans knew none. The first 100 meters cost the boarding force 9 dead and took the better part of an hour, and it was, Okonkwo said afterward, the worst fighting he had seen in a life that had seen a great deal of it, because the enemy was good and the ground was theirs, and there was nowhere to be but forward. And through all of it, at every corner in every chamber, the human force made the distinction. This was the thing that the Sept's troops could not understand, and that slowed them, and that in the end undid them. The humans did not shoot everything that moved. They could not afford to. Wren had built the whole assault around it, and so they did not, even under fire, even bleeding, even with their own dead cooling in the corridors behind them. When they broke into a chamber and found household troops, they fought and won, and moved on. When they broke into a chamber and found the other inhabitants of the anvil, the cooks, the clerks, the medics, the maintenance crews, the vast unarmed staff that keeps any great fortress running, and that the Sept regarded as furniture, they did not fight. They held them and secured them, and moved on, and left them alive and unharmed behind the advancing line, guarded by soldiers who had been drilled until the not shooting was as fast as the shooting. It slowed the assault. Of course it slowed the assault. Every unarmed Ketzari the boarding force encountered was a decision that had to be made under fire, a fraction of a second in which a frightened human in hard armor had to see the difference between a soldier and a cook and act on the difference, and every one of those fractions was a fraction in which the human could be killed by the actual soldier at the far end of the chamber. The planners had known this. Wren had known it. They had spent the extra human lives to buy it deliberately, and now, in the corridors of the anvil, the humans spent more, and did not stop making the distinction, because the distinction was the whole reason they had come. There was a moment, Wren saw it, and would remember it for the rest of her life, when the thing they had built was tested to its edge and held. It was in the 4th hour of the assault, in a wide low chamber that had been some kind of galley, and the fighting had swept through it and left it strewn with the Sept's household dead, and Sergeant Okonkwo came through the far door with his weapon up and his blood high and found, pressed into the corner behind an overturned table, a cluster of Ketzari cooks, and among them 3 children. They were officers' children, most likely, kept in the fortress the way the Sept kept everything it valued close. They were young, younger than Sepha Ilan had been, some of them, and they were terrified. And they were exactly, precisely, unbearably the thing that the whole operation existed to protect. And they were also, in that moment, the thing that a grieving man with a dead brother and a dead cousin might, in the red haze of the 4th hour, mistake for a target. Okonkwo stopped. Wren was 6 meters away and saw the whole of it, saw the weapon come up, saw the sergeant's whole body go rigid with the war between what his grief wanted and what his oath demanded, saw the long, terrible second in which the anvil's corridors and the murdered girl and the dead brother and the dead cousin all pressed down on a single human being with a weapon in his hands and a clear shot at the children of his enemy. She did not shout. She had learned, somewhere in the 4 weeks, that shouting at a man in that second only makes the second louder. She said quietly on the private channel, so that only he could hear it. "Sergeant, that's Sefa, that's her right there, that's who we came for." And Okonkwo lowered his weapon. He lowered it slowly, and his hands were shaking, and when it was down he stood for a moment with his eyes shut and his chest heaving, and then he keyed his own channel and said, in a voice scraped raw, "Non-combatants galley, secure them." And the moment passed, and the children lived, and the war that mattered, the one that had never been about the anvil at all, was won in that corner of a fortress galley by a man who did the hardest thing a wounded person can do, which is to refuse to pass his wound along. Bel Anya reached the children a minute later and knelt among them with the doubled medical supplies that had cost the boarding force its speed, and one of them, the smallest, had been hurt in the fighting, a fragment, a bad one, and the medic worked over the Ketzari child in the ruined galley with exactly the same focus she would have brought to one of her own, and the child lived and grew up and told the story for the rest of a long life to people who did not always believe it. Wren watched that too. She made herself watch all of it, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this, the medic on her knees in the wreckage, saving the child of the enemy because the alternative was to become the enemy, this was the answer, not the fleets breaking, not the fortresses falling. This, the mercy that cost them, freely given, in the heart of the thing that had shown them none, that was what Earth had crossed the dark to say. They reached the command heart of the anvil in the 6th hour. The last of the household troops made their stand in the great vaulted chamber that the Sept called the seat, and they died there, well and hard, defending a thing that did not deserve them. And when the last of them was down, the human boarding force came into the seat and found, at the center of it, on a dais built to make one figure loom above all others, the Iron Sept V. He had not fled. There was nowhere to flee to. The human ships held the sky above the anvil, and the fortress moon that had been the fixed center of a dozen conquered civilizations was, in the 6th hour, a taken thing. But he had not tried, and Wren understood, looking at him across the vaulted chamber, that the not trying was the last move of a mind that had spent its whole life in the calculus of power, and was making, even now, one final calculation. He would be terrible to the end. He would be the immovable center to the end. If he could not rule, he would at least deny them the thing he assumed they had come for, which was the satisfaction of his fear. He did not know them at all. That was his last and largest error, the one that contained all the others. Wren came up the length of the seat with her company behind her, and she stopped at the foot of the dais, and she looked up at the Iron Sept V. and he looked down at her, and she watched the calculation happen behind the old, cold, contemptuous eyes. She watched him see her age. She watched him understand, the way Admiral Vane had promised he would, that the thing which had come across the dark to end him was young, barely begun, her whole life still ahead of her, standing in the ruin of everything he had built. She watched the contempt arrive, right on schedule, the reflexive contempt of an ancient apparatus for a child that presumed to judge it. "You are young," the Archon said. His translated voice filled the vaulted chamber, smooth and untroubled, the same voice that had reached down and touched the world. "They sent a child to take a throne. Do you imagine this is a victory? Do you imagine you have changed anything? The Dominion is old, human. It was old before your kind crawled out of your gravity well. You have broken my fleets and taken my fortresses, and you have, I am told, spared my subjects, which I confess I do not understand, and which I suspect you will come to regret. But you have not changed the shape of the universe. Power is power. Strength is strength. When your grief has cooled and your discipline has frayed, you will be exactly what I am, and you will do exactly what I have done because it is the only thing there is to do. You have merely postponed becoming me." He leaned forward on the dais, and something that was almost pity moved across the ancient face. "I killed one of your children to teach you what you are. You have come all this way to prove me right." And Wren Costa, 27 years old, standing at the foot of the throne of the thing that had executed Sepha Ilan to send a message, gave the Iron Sept its answer. "No," she said. She did not raise her voice. That, too, was a discipline, and she had earned it across 4 weeks and 6 hours, and a lifetime that had turned out to be exactly long enough. She stood at the foot of the dais with the ruin of his empire behind her and his contempt raining down from above her, and she gave him a single word quietly, and then she gave him the rest. "You killed a child to teach us what we are," she said. "You were wrong about what we are. You've been wrong about it this whole time, and you're still wrong, standing here at the end of everything you built, and I think you're going to die wrong because I don't believe a thing like you can learn the lesson in the time you have left. But I'm going to tell it to you anyway, not because you'll understand it, because I need you to have heard it before this is over." She took a step up the dais. Behind her, the company did not move. They had their orders, and the orders were the strangest any of them had ever been given, and they held to them. "You looked at us and you saw yourself," Wren said. "That's the only thing you know how to see. You looked at a species with ships and grief and a reason to burn your worlds, and you assumed we'd burn them because that's what you would have done, because that's what you did over and over for 1,000 years, to everyone smaller than you. You built a whole empire on the certainty that the universe belongs to whoever's willing to be the most terrible. And when we came, you waited for us to prove you right." She was on the dais now, level with him, close enough to see the fine tremor the ancient face was working so hard to still. "We didn't. Look out there." She did not point, she did not need to. The whole shattered fortress, the whole spared dominion hung in the space between them. "Your subjects are alive. Your shipwrights are alive. Your grandmothers are alive, and your farmers and your clerks and the children in your galleys, all of them, everyone alive, because we spent our own people's lives to keep them that way. Do you know what that cost us? Do you have the faintest idea? We buried men today to spare Ketzari we've never met. We went slow so we could go clean. We could have ended this in an hour from orbit and lost no one. And instead we came in by hand and bled for 6 of them so that when it was over we could still look at ourselves. That's what we are. Not what you thought. Not you, done better. Something you never once in your long life imagined was possible because you'd killed the part of yourself that could imagine it." "Sentiment," the Archon said, but the word came out thin. "Discipline," Wren said. "Sentiment is what you thought grief was, something loud, something that burns out, something you could wait behind your walls until it passed. You never understood that the most dangerous thing a species can do with a murdered child is get quiet get exact. Turn the grief into something cold that doesn't burn out because it's not on fire in the first place. That's what came across the dark for you, not our rage, our resolve. Rage would have burned your worlds and proven you right and let you die a martyr with something to avenge. Resolve took your empire apart one note at a time, spared everyone you despised, and left you standing here with nothing to be but what you actually are." She let that sit. "You're not a fallen glory, Archon. You never were a glory. You're a crime, and we didn't come here to kill you. We came here to arrest you." For the first time, something broke through the contempt on the ancient face, and it was not fear exactly, and it was not understanding. It was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of a creature that has stood at the center of the universe for 1,000 years discovering, in a single instant, that the center was never where it thought. "You will not," he said, "make me small." "No," Wren agreed. "We're going to make you accountable. That's worse for something like you. I know it is. Death would have been a mercy and a monument both, and you'd have taken it gladly, and somewhere in the Dominion there'd be a shrine to the Archon who died unbroken. You don't get that. You get a courtroom. You get every world you burned and every people you broke and every child you murdered to send a message, all of it named. All of it entered into a record the whole galaxy can see. All of it answered not with a fire but with a verdict. You're going to sit and hear what you were, out loud in front of everyone, and then you're going to spend what's left of your life as the thing you were most afraid of being. Not a tyrant, not a legend, just an old criminal who got caught. She keyed her channel without looking away from him. "Sergeant, take him. Alive, whole, and gently. He doesn't get to be a wound either." And Okonkwo, the man who had lowered his weapon in a galley 4 hours before, came up the dais and took the Archon Sevic Vihal into custody with hands that did not tremble now, and did him no violence at all, which was, in the end, the cruelest and most complete thing that could have been done to him. They called it Oblivion afterward. The word came from the galaxy, not from Earth. Humanity itself never used it, being disinclined to grand names. But the watching peoples, reaching for something large enough to hold what they had seen, settled on that word, and it stuck, and it was not wrong, so long as one understood precisely what had been sent into oblivion and what had not. The Iron Sept was gone. Not diminished, not defeated, not driven back to lick its wounds and return in a generation, gone, wholly and finally, in the space of a single hour across the whole span of its territory. Its fleets were broken. Its fortresses were taken. Its regional archons and its high command and its archon of archons were in human custody, bound for a reckoning the like of which the galaxy had never staged. The apparatus that had ruled a dozen civilizations for 1,000 years, the vast patient engine for the conversion of other people's futures into the Dominion's power, had ceased to exist. That was the Oblivion. That was total. There was no piece of the Sept left anywhere in the galaxy from which the Sept could grow again, because humanity had understood the thing well enough to take out all of it at once, root and branch and seed. And the Ketzari lived. That was the other half of the word, and the half that mattered more, and the half that made the Oblivion a thing of grief and justice rather than a thing of slaughter. 1 billion Ketzari on the cradle world woke the next morning to a sky that no longer had the anvil in it, and to a silence where the Sept had always been, and to the strange and vertiginous discovery that the apparatus which had ruled every hour of their lives and their parents' lives and their parents' parents' lives was simply over. They had not been punished for it. They had not been made to answer for crimes that had never been theirs, ordered by a war caste that had never asked them, committed by a regime that had despised them nearly as much as it despised its enemies. The shipwrights kept their yards. The farmers kept their fields. The subject species, the Duvik and the Own and all the others the Sept had held in bondage, found themselves, for the first time in centuries, in possession of their own skies, and humanity did not stay to rule those skies in the Sept's place, because to have done so would have been to become the Sept, and the whole 1,000-mile-long point of everything had been not to. There were those in the galaxy who called this weakness. There always are. There were old powers who watched humanity break the strongest apparatus in the region and then simply leave the freed worlds free, leave the spared billions unruled, leave without an empire to show for the largest fleet action anyone had ever seen, and who concluded in the comfortable dark of their own assumptions that the humans were sentimental, soft, destined to be eaten by something harder. They were making the Archon's error. They would go on making it, some of them, for a long time, until they too were made to understand. Because the peoples who had watched more closely understood something else entirely, and it changed the shape of that whole region of the galaxy in the years that followed, quietly, the way deep things change. They had seen a species take absolute power and give it back. They had seen a wounded people hold, under every pressure and every temptation, to the line between the guilty and the innocent, and pay in its own blood to keep that line clean. They had seen, in short, the one thing the Iron Sept in all its cruelty had never once managed to be, and the one thing that no amount of cruelty can counterfeit, trustworthy asterisk. And a species that the galaxy could trust to be strong without being terrible was a thing so rare and so valuable that the old, careful powers began, one by one, in their own slow way, to draw closer to it. Not out of fear. Out of the recognition that something new had come into the dark, and that it might, against all the evidence of a cruel galaxy's long history, be worth standing near. The reckoning of the Iron Sept was held in the end on a neutral world, before a court assembled from the peoples the Sept had wronged, and it was long, and it was public, and it was by design, by the insistence of the young officer who had taken the Archon and the old admiral who had planned it all scrupulously, almost unbearably fair. The Archon Sevik Vihal was given every protection he had denied to every soul who had ever stood before him, and he was heard, and the crimes of his regime were entered into the record one by one, world by world, name by name, until the record was a thing that took days to read, and that no one who heard it ever entirely put down again. And near the end of it, among 1,000 names, was entered the name of a human girl, taken from the survey settlement at Halden's Reach, executed to send a message. It was read once, plainly, without spectacle, and then the record moved on, because she had never been a symbol to the people who loved her. She had been a child, with a gap in her front teeth and a fierce practical curiosity about how the engines knew where to push, and they would not let her be made into anything else, not even by those who meant to honor her. Commander Wren Costa attended the reckoning for exactly 1 day and gave her testimony, and left. She did not want to be a symbol either. She went back to the fleet, to the *Cepha's answer *, to the ordinary work of an officer in a galaxy that had rearranged itself around a thing she had done, and that she preferred not to discuss. In time she was promoted, and in more time she commanded, and she carried through the whole of a long career the particular gravity of someone who has stood at the foot of a tyrant's throne and chosen the harder thing. And the officers who served under her never quite knew why she went so still when something mattered, or why she was so exact about the difference between the guilty and the innocent, or why she would spend anything, any cost, to keep that line clean. They only knew that she did, and that the fleet was better for it, and that when she gave an order it had underneath it a weight that older officers with grander reputations somehow lacked. Admiral Idris Vane lived to see the reckoning concluded, and then, having seen it, allowed himself at last to retire, and he told Wren once, near the end, that he had chosen her because she was young enough to still believe the hard thing was possible, and that the whole of his own long life had been leading, without his knowing it, to the single act of handing the sharpest point of a grieving world's justice to someone who had her entire future still ahead of her. "They killed a child to tell us we had none," he said. "You were the answer, not a child, but young and unbroken and standing in the ruin of everything they built, telling them it was over." He smiled, which he rarely did. "You were the future they thought they could frighten into obedience." And it turned out the future doesn't frighten, it just comes. The Iron Sept had reached down through the layered defenses of a small world and set its hand upon every screen, and it had shown the human species a child, and it had executed her to send a message, and the message had been, "You have no future, be afraid. Obey." Earth answered, and the answer took the shape of Oblivion, but not the Oblivion the Sept had known how to deal in, the burning of worlds and the ending of peoples, the crude arithmetic of terror it had practiced for 1,000 years. Earth's Oblivion was finer and more total and more terrible than any fire, the complete and precise unmaking of a regime, its fleets and its fortresses and its command, and its Archon lifted whole out of a civilization that was left standing, so that the apparatus of cruelty was sent utterly into the dark, while every soul it had ruled and wronged and despised was spared to see the morning. The Sept had wanted to teach humanity that power is the willingness to be terrible. Humanity had answered by proving that the greater power, the rarer and more frightening power, is the willingness not asterisk to be, to hold, in the coldest grief, to the line between the guilty and the innocent, and to pay in one's own blood to keep it clean. They had executed a human girl to send a message. Earth received it and grieved and went quiet, and did the arithmetic, and answered, not with the murder of a people, but with the end of a regime's impunity forever. And when the last of it was done, and the Sept was gone into the oblivion it had earned, and a billion spared souls woke beneath a sky at last their own. The only monument the human species raised was a name, read once and plainly into a lawful record, of a child who had wanted to know how the engines knew where to push, and a young commander, her whole life still ahead of her, standing unbroken in the ruin, who had made certain the galaxy would remember that the answer to that question in the end had been mercy.